The bones beneath the hearth. The fire crackles low in the back of the cave. Smoke coils upward, darkening the jagged limestone above. Beneath it, buried in sediment and ash, lies something no one living in this time will ever understand. A tiny skeleton curled like a question mark. She is swaddled not in cloth, but in layers of ochre-stained earth and centuries of silence. For tens of thousands of years this infant remained hidden beneath the very place where warmth, food, and storytelling once gathered. It wasn't until modern archaeologists excavated this hearth that they found her, unexpected, delicate, and far older than any had imagined. In 2017, deep inside the Arma Vairana cave in northwestern Italy, a team of researchers uncovered a grave dating back roughly 10,000 years before the invention of agriculture. The skeleton belonged to a baby girl, just 40 to 50 days old, interred with a remarkable array of artifacts. Beads made from pierced shells, red ochre pigment, and carefully positioned bones. Her presence under the hearth was both accidental and deliberate, preserved by layers of habitation and time. One mainstream fact: this is one of the oldest known graves of a female Homo sapiens in Europe. What makes this more than just a poignant archaeological find is the context. This was not a high-status individual, a warrior or a leader. She was a newborn. And yet, the complexity and care of her burial suggests something profound. A worldview where even the briefest life had value. A quirky detail? Some of the beads buried with her show polish consistent with long-term wear, perhaps handed down from her mother or kin. And here's where debate begins. Scholars still argue whether this burial reflects symbolic behaviour, maternal grief, or a deeper spiritual belief system. Was this a cultural anomaly, or evidence of an emotional universality stretching back to Ice Age minds? We don't know. But standing at the edge of that ancient hearth, staring into the darkness beyond the firelight, it's hard not to feel the weight of her presence. If deep history fascinates you, consider subscribing for more. Discovery in the shadows. Arma Vairana Cave doesn't give up its secrets easily. Nestled in the Ligurian Alps of Italy, it's a damp, cold place, more a long scar in the earth than a wide cathedral of stone. Researchers originally came here not to search for graves, but to study the stone tools and seasonal habits of Upper Paleolithic hunter-gatherers. But in 2017, as they sifted through layers of sediment, a cluster of unusual artifacts caught their eye. Perforated shell beads, ochre-stained soil, and fragments of tiny bones. The pattern was unmistakable, a grave. The excavation that followed was painstaking. Archaeologists worked inch by inch, toothpick by toothpick, documenting every contour and fibre. The skeleton was fragile, so small that her femur measured scarcely 4 centimetres long. Yet despite her size, she had been buried with extraordinary care. More than 60 shell beads and pendants were found around her head and chest. These were not decorative afterthoughts, they were placed with purpose. Mainstream fact: radiocarbon dating confirmed that the infant, now nicknamed Neve, died more than 10,000 years ago, placing her in the late Epigravettian period, just as Ice Age glaciers were retreating from Europe. The name Neve, meaning snow, is a tribute to both the baby's delicate state and the cold, harsh time in which she lived. A curious tidbit emerged when researchers examined the grave goods more closely. Many of the shell beads came from species native to the Mediterranean coast, far from the mountain cave. Some were worn smooth from generations of use, likely heirlooms passed down through multiple hands before finding their final home with Neve. It wasn't just a burial, it was a transfer of memory. Scholars still debate whether this level of adornment was common or unique. Was Neve's burial a widespread cultural practice, or was she special in some way, a firstborn perhaps, or the child of a spiritual figure? And if so, why bury her beneath the hearth, the very centre of communal life? We may never know the emotional tone of those who laid her there, but the archaeological record suggests this was no hasty farewell. This was ceremony. This was meaning inscribed into soil. A child in a time of ice. To understand Neve's death, we must first understand her life, or at least the world she was born into. Around 10,000 years ago, the Ice Age was loosening its grip on Europe. Glaciers still loomed in the north, but southern regions like Liguria were slowly warming. Forests were returning, rivers ran higher. Herds of red deer and ibex roamed the valleys, stalked by wolves and early humans armed with flint-tipped spears. It was a time of transition, of rebirth, but also of instability. Life expectancy was short, infant mortality was high. Even under the best conditions, a baby born in the Upper Paleolithic had to survive unpredictable climate shifts, scarce food, and the ever-present threat of infection. And yet, these prehistoric people adapted brilliantly. They developed seasonal migration routes, complex toolkits, and rich symbolic cultures that defy our assumptions about cavemen. Mainstream fact: the Epigravatian people of Italy left behind more than just stone tools. Cave paintings, shell jewellery, and engraved bones show that they had a deep artistic life, and likely a spiritual one. The burial of Neve fits this pattern of symbolic sophistication. Among the strangest finds from this era are small limestone figurines shaped like women, known as Venus figurines. Found across Ice Age Europe, their exaggerated features have puzzled archaeologists for decades. Were they fertility icons, totems of female power, or toys? What they show, indisputably, is that Paleolithic people thought deeply about womanhood and birth. Perhaps Neve's death carried a symbolic resonance we can't yet grasp. A fringe but fascinating theory suggests that the ornamentation found in Neve's grave may reflect her role in a matrilineal clan system. The shell beads, reused, repaired and worn, might have been passed down the maternal line, marking her as a future inheritor of status, cut short before she could grow into it. Scholars still debate whether infant burials like Neve's represent a broader pattern or isolated acts of grief. Only a handful of such graves have been found across Europe. Is that because few were buried, or because their tiny bones are so easily lost to time? The soil doesn't say, but the presence of ceremonial care tells us that even the youngest lives held meaning. Neve was not a survivor, but she was not discarded either. Her short life was marked in stone, shell, and ochre, perhaps the earliest love letter we found, written in the language of mourning, a toolkit of sorrow. The artifacts found alongside Neve weren't just decorative, they were deliberate. Tiny shell beads, many with wear patterns suggesting long use, had been arranged carefully near her body. Red ochre, earthy iron pigment often associated with burial, was smeared in streaks and clusters around the remains. A single eagle talon, worn smooth by handling, lay nestled among the beads. These were not grave goods in the modern sense. They were tools of ritual, of memory, of farewell. Mainstream fact: the use of red ochre in burials dates back over 100,000 years. It appears in Neanderthal graves, in early Homo sapiens burials, and across continents. Its consistent association with death hints at deep symbolic meaning, possibly linked to blood, life force, or transformation. But what makes Neve's grave stand out is the sheer concentration of ornamentation. Over 60 beads were counted, some pierced, some not, many showing signs of repair. They were not randomly placed. Some were found in clusters near what would have been her neck and waist. Others were scattered gently, perhaps by wind, water, or the slow shifting of earth over time. Then there's the eagle talon. Similar talons have been found in Neanderthal sites, rare objects that may have been worn as necklaces or used in rituals. In Neve's case, it suggests a connection to older traditions or a symbolic animal role, perhaps protection in the afterlife, or a tribute to a clan totem. A quirky tidbit: Some of the shell beads in Neve's grave came from marine species not native to the nearby coast. They had likely been traded inland or carried from distant shores, suggesting wide social networks even in prehistoric times. The presence of these beads in an infant's grave speaks volumes about her family's connections and priorities. Scholars still debate whether grave goods in Paleolithic burials indicate individual status, family grief, or broader community rituals. In Neve's case, the richness of her burial raises uncomfortable questions. Was she being honoured or mourned with the trappings of a future she'd never reach? The line between symbolic and sentimental is blurry across millennia. There's no written language to guide us, no oral tradition survived to explain the significance of each bead. But when we map the grave, its colour, layout, ornamentation, it begins to read like a sentence not meant for us, but preserved anyway. The beads whisper stories, the talon adds punctuation, and the ochre binds them all together. Neve's burial was not an accident of preservation. It was an act of intention, an emotional response encoded in objects. Cave that became a cradle. The place where Neve was buried, Arma Veirana, was no bustling settlement. It was a shallow cave tucked into the limestone cliffs of northern Italy's Ligurian Alps. For much of prehistory it served as a temporary shelter. Hunters likely passed through seasonally, pausing to prepare meals or tools, then moving on. Yet for reasons unknown, someone chose to place a fragile infant in its rocky hollow, turning a waypoint into a memorial. Mainstream fact: Arma Veirana has yielded traces of human use dating back more than 40,000 years. Its sediment layers hold clues to Neanderthal presence, modern human activity, and now one of the oldest confirmed female infant burials in Europe. The cave's longevity makes it a rare archaeological time capsule. What's striking is how unremarkable the cave seems, at least at first glance. There are no large hearths, no evidence of permanent structures. It likely served as a liminal space, a place of passage, not permanence. And yet, amid that transience, Neve was laid to rest. The burial pit was shallow, carved directly into centuries of accumulated debris. There was no stone sarcophagus, no constructed tomb, just earth, beads, and time. Quirky tidbit: the cave's entrance had partially collapsed by the time researchers arrived. They only discovered Neve's grave because looters had disturbed nearby sediment in search of prehistoric tools. What they inadvertently exposed was not flint or bone, at least not in the usual sense, but the top of a tiny skull, inches below the surface. This accidental discovery led to a years-long excavation, with scientists painstakingly removing layer after layer of compacted soil. Unlike grand tombs of later eras, the cave offered no grandeur, only clues. Fossilized pollen hinted at the season of burial. Sediment analysis traced environmental shifts. Even microbial residues on the beads provided a rough sense of how the body had decayed. Scholars still debate whether caves like Arma Veirana were chosen for their acoustics, their symbolism, or simply their shelter. Did the echo of a mother's cry feel more profound in that space? Did the darkness seem closer to the realm of spirits? Or was it simply convenient, dry, and hidden? Whatever the reason, the cave became a cradle, and not just for Neve. It became a cradle for the science that would follow. Today, its walls bear silent witness to acts of care, of confusion, and of continuity. And as we map its sediment layers, we realize we're not just uncovering prehistory, we're being gently pulled into it. Beads, claws, and symbolic threads. Around Neve's tiny remains lay an unexpected collection of objects. Pierced shell beads, eagle talons, and fragments of ornamental tools. For a baby who likely lived only weeks, it's an elaborate send-off, one that raises deep questions about the meaning of death and personhood in the Paleolithic world. Mainstream fact: over 60 shell beads were recovered from the burial, many of them stained red with ochre and shaped into pendants. These were not random debris. Each bead had been carefully placed, some around the skull, others lining the torso, suggesting they were sewn onto a garment or cradle shroud. These weren't just pretty trinkets. The shells came from the Ligurian Sea, over 15 kilometers away. Transporting them inland required intention. Some had been reused, worn smooth from handling and restrung. The talons likely came from golden eagles, powerful birds rarely encountered up close. Their inclusion may hint at ritual symbolism, status, or protective belief. Quirky tidbit. Microscopic wear on the beads suggests they were once worn by adults before being given to Neve. Some even show residues of milk or plant oils, possibly from prolonged skin contact. It's as if the community passed their tokens down, embedding the child's body with memories not her own. This level of care opens a window into social complexity. In a world where survival was harsh, why spend hours crafting adornments for a baby who would never see her first spring? The answer may lie in how we define value, not in terms of contribution, but connection. For this community, the child was not disposable. She was grieved, cherished, and honoured. Scholars still debate whether such grave goods signal a belief in an afterlife, or something more immediate, perhaps a desire to ease the transition between life and death, or a symbolic tether between the living and the departed. Were the beads meant to guide Neve's spirit, to declare her place in the group, or simply to say, "You were here"? One clue lies in the beads' number and placement. They cluster most densely near the head and chest, locations we still associate with identity and emotion. It's as though those who buried her understood what it meant to mark a body with care, to use ornament not as decoration but as declaration. Neve's grave reminds us that symbolism is not modern. It predates cathedrals and scriptures. It speaks in beads and claws, in colour and placement, and in that language we hear something timeless: love, loss, and the desperate attempt to make sense of both. The ochre mystery, painting the dead. Beneath Neve's bones, the earth wasn't just dirt, it was red. Vibrant red ochre, powdered and packed beneath and around her body, stained the soil in a halo of colour. It's one of the most iconic markers of ancient burial, and yet its meaning remains elusive. Why did our ancestors paint the dead? Mainstream fact: red ochre, an iron-rich mineral ground into powder, appears in burials dating back at least 100,000 years. At Archaeologists, it was found concentrated around Neve's skull and torso, strongly suggesting deliberate placement, not environmental coincidence. Ochre requires effort to procure. It doesn't just sit around in usable form. It has to be collected, crushed, and often heated or mixed with fat or water. In Neve's case, the application appears intentional, possibly brushed or sprinkled during burial. This act of colouring death echoes across continents and millennia. Quirky tidbit: some anthropologists propose that red ochre may have been used not only for ritual purposes, but also for practical ones. Its antibacterial properties could help preserve skin or mask decay. Others point to symbolic interpretations: red as blood, as life force, as rebirth. Scholars still debate whether ochre use in burials signifies a spiritual belief, or is simply cultural tradition. Was it a signal to ancestors, a way to honour the dead, or just an inherited ritual performed without questioning? In Neve's case, the red dust becomes a whisper, one that we're still trying to interpret. There's also the aesthetic angle. Some researchers argue that ochre in burials connects to body art, tattoos or skin painting that marked identity. Could the burial ritual be extending a tradition of adornment into death? If Neve had lived longer, would her skin have been painted with the same pigment? At Archaeologists, the vivid ochre stands out against the grey limestone and pale bones. It draws the eye, just as it might have drawn the hearts of those who came to mourn. The colour makes a visual statement. This is not just a body, this is someone, this is ours. There is something timeless about the gesture. We still use colour to mark death. Black veils, white shrouds, flowers of every hue. But red has always meant something primal. In Neve's grave, it may have been a promise, a prayer, or a scream. Whatever its origin, the ochre makes one thing clear: this burial wasn't a mistake or a disposal. It was a ceremony, a moment of intention, drawn in the only paint they had: earth and iron, life and death, crushed into dust and laid at the feet of grief. The headdress and the shells. Scattered delicately around Neve's tiny skull were dozens of tiny seashells, perforated, polished, and arranged in a manner too precise to be accidental. These weren't the refuse of a meal, they were jewellery. And not just jewellery, they were part of a headdress, woven together with fibres that long ago decayed. Neve, it seems, had been buried crowned. Mainstream fact, over 60 shell beads, mostly Columbella rustica, a type of Mediterranean sea snail, were found at the site. These were deliberately modified with small holes and signs of wear, suggesting they had been strung or sewn onto fabric. Many were clustered around Neve's head, particularly near the forehead and temples. What makes this discovery so remarkable is that it represents one of the earliest known examples of such personal adornment for an infant. In most Paleolithic burials, elaborate grave goods are typically reserved for adults or occasionally high-status adolescents. But here a newborn was treated with startling reverence. Quirky tidbit: some of the shells appear to have traces of red ochre on them, implying they were decorated or symbolically charged before being buried. Others bear wear patterns that indicate they were likely passed down, possibly heirlooms worn by Neve's mother or another community member, before being given to the child in death. Scholars still debate whether the headdress was constructed specifically for Neve's burial, or whether it was a repurposed item of familial or social importance. Was it a badge of lineage, a ceremonial offering, or a token of maternal grief? The symbolism is as profound as it is opaque. The use of shells for personal ornamentation dates back tens of thousands of years. They've been found in North Africa, Siberia, and Australia, often associated with early symbolic behaviour. But in Neve's case, the detail and arrangement suggest not just decoration but identity. This baby wasn't buried as just a lost life. She was someone, possibly even seen as someone important. The craftsmanship matters too. The beads are uniform in size and carefully drilled, no easy feat with stone tools. That level of effort implies meaning. It suggests that even in a time of survival, aesthetics and ritual held space. And so we picture her, this tiny human swaddled in skin and fur, her head adorned with a shimmer of ancient shells. The hands that arranged them, perhaps trembling, perhaps reverent, left behind a language we're only beginning to read. In that language of bead and bone, the message feels clear. Even the youngest among them was worthy of memory, worthy of beauty, worthy of ceremony. The headdress is a halo, and Neve was not forgotten. Echoes of other burials. Neve's grave may be singular in its tenderness, but it's not entirely alone. Across the Upper Paleolithic world, other burials, some older, some younger, show hints of similar ritual care. Together, they sketch a fragile but fascinating map of how our ancestors mourned, remembered, and perhaps even believed. Mainstream fact. In Sungir, Russia, dated to around 34,000 years ago, 2 children were buried head to head, their bodies adorned with thousands of mammoth ivory beads, spears carved from straightened ivory, and other carefully crafted items. One child was no older than 10, the other possibly even younger. Like Neve, they were encased in meaning. The Sungir burials, with their extreme richness, have long puzzled archaeologists. Were these children royalty? Were they seen as divine? Or does their burial simply reflect a society in which death, even young death, deserved grandeur? Quirky tidbit. The beads in the Sungir children's graves may have taken an estimated 10,000 hours to craft. That's more than a full year of skilled labour. Time spent not hunting, not gathering, but making tiny ornaments for a child's final hour. Scholars still debate whether these burials represent widespread cultural values or rare exceptions. Are they the tip of a symbolic iceberg, or were they reserved for the elite, or for unique circumstances, such as twins, illnesses, or unusual birth stories? Other burials from Upper Paleolithic Europe hint at more modest but still meaningful practices. At Grotte des Enfants in Liguria, Italy, a child was buried with pierced deer teeth and red ochre. In the Czech Republic's Dolní Věstonice, a triple burial includes a young woman flanked by 2 adolescent males, one with spinal deformities, perhaps hinting at social roles or beliefs about the body and its afterlife. What Neve's burial adds to this tapestry is its quiet intimacy. There is no grand spear, no thousands of beads, no twin beside her. Instead, there is the care of a few hands, the offering of well-worn shells, the protective weight of a hearth's stones. If Sungir is a royal monument, Neve's grave is a lullaby, and yet both suggest something powerfully consistent, that humans, even in harsh Ice Age landscapes, found time for ritual, that grief is old, that art, adornment, and memory are not luxuries of modern civilization, but tools our species has always reached for when faced with death. We may never know precisely what these early people believed about the afterlife, but what we see, again and again, is that they did something. They marked the moment. They gave the body meaning. And in doing so, they left a message for us, thousands of years later. Love lasts. Shells, stones, and symbolism. Let's return to Neve's grave and the tiny treasures buried with her, those pierced shell beads, red ochre traces, and flint flakes. They may seem like humble offerings, but they're more than just decoration. They're clues, each one a cipher that points to the symbolic language of her community. Mainstream fact: the beads buried with Neve came from marine mollusks found over 60 kilometers from the burial site. This indicates not only deliberate selection but also a network of movement, either seasonal migration or trade. These shells weren't chosen at random, they had value even far inland. Archaeologists have found that similar shell beads, especially those with tiny perforations for stringing, appear in Upper Paleolithic graves across Europe and the Levant. They often cluster near the head, neck and chest, suggesting necklaces or amulets. In Neve's case, the arrangement suggests the beads may have adorned a garment or been laid as a string over the child's body. Quirky tidbit: one of the shells found with Neve, a Dentalium species, has been used in burial traditions spanning continents and millennia. It even appears in Native American regalia thousands of years later, though the cultures are unrelated. Perhaps some shapes and textures simply speak to the human soul. Scholars still debate whether these shell ornaments were decorative, protective, or communicative. Were they symbols of family, totems of clan identity, or offerings to a spirit world designed to guide the deceased on some imagined journey? Red ochre adds another layer to the mystery. This iron-rich pigment, often linked to early symbolic behavior, is present in hundreds of ancient burials. In Neve's grave, its faint traces suggest it was sprinkled or smeared, perhaps onto her skin, the beads, or the grave itself. Some have interpreted ochre as a stand-in for blood, vitality, or rebirth. Others believe it warded off evil. Then there's the flint. A single worked flake, possibly a tool or blade, was found in the burial. Some researchers think it's symbolic, a tool for the next life. Others suggest it may have been a parent's keepsake, a token of work or protection left behind. Together, these elements, shell, stone, pigment, form a small but potent symbolic lexicon. In a world without writing, without temples, this is how meaning was made. Not through sermons, but through texture. Not through scriptures, but through the careful placement of things. And here, in Neve's grave, those things still speak, quietly, powerfully. They remind us that even in prehistory, we were already crafting a language of loss and memory. That symbols aren't inventions of civilization, they are its precursors, whispers of a community. Step back from Neve's grave for a moment. Zoom out. Imagine the burial not as an isolated act of grief, but as part of a larger, beating social organism. A Paleolithic community huddled on the rugged Italian coast, facing storms, hunger, predators, and the unknowable future together. Mainstream fact: the Armavirana cave isn't just a burial site. Archaeologists have uncovered stone tools, butchered animal bones, hearth residues, and flint debris scattered throughout. These finds point to repeated occupation, possibly seasonal visits by a group of foragers who returned year after year, and that tells us something remarkable. Neve's burial didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened in a place already weighted with meaning, a shared shelter, a hearth-lit refuge. Her community chose to place her among the living, in a space layered with soot and stories. This wasn't a graveyard, it was home. Scholars still debate whether early Homo sapiens lived in nuclear families, clans or loose bands, but whatever the structure, Neve's death must have rippled outward. She was known, loved, cared for even after her last breath. The grave goods, the ochre, the careful placement, none of this suggests indifference. It suggests a collective gesture. Quirky tidbit. In some contemporary hunter-gatherer cultures, infants are not buried immediately after death. Instead, rituals unfold over several days, with the body present for songs, offerings, and community mourning. It's impossible to know if Neve's people did the same, but the idea that Paleolithic groups engaged in ritualized grieving is not far-fetched. What's most moving is the intentionality of it all. Someone gathered those shells, someone chipped the flint, someone sat stone in hand carving that tiny grave into the cave floor. These were acts of time and tenderness, expensive in an age when every calorie and hour counted. There's even evidence that the burial pit may have been reopened after initial interment, perhaps to add more items, or to check on the body. If true, it suggests an evolving, relational view of the dead, not just bury and forget, but something ongoing, even participatory. In a way, Neve's grave is less a snapshot and more a conversation, one that began with her death, but didn't end there. Her body became a point around which memory, belief, and identity coalesced, a kind of sacred nucleus for a transient group. And if you listen closely, you can almost hear them. The whispered prayers, the weeping, the soft crunch of feet in the cave's ash. A community, pausing its endless hunt for survival, to honour one of its smallest voices. What Neve still teaches us. In the end, what makes Neve's grave so haunting isn't just its age, it's the layers of earth, of emotion, of mystery. Hers is not the earliest burial we've found, nor the most elaborate, but it might be one of the most intimate. A human story, paused mid-sentence, preserved in ochre and bone. Mainstream fact. As of 2021, Neve's burial is the oldest known example of a female infant grave in Europe, dated to roughly 10,000 years before the present. Yet despite the age, her remains speak with a shocking immediacy, like a voice calling from across a vast canyon of time. What can she teach us? Quite a lot. About care, about community, about how early humans, often stereotyped as brutish or survival-focused, were capable of deep, deliberate tenderness. Her burial tells us that grief is not modern, love is not modern, ritual is not modern. These things run deeper than civilization itself. Scholars still debate whether such burials represent rare anomalies or the tips of much larger, now lost traditions. Could we be missing countless other infant graves, either too subtle to detect or destroyed by time? If so, Neve may be the ambassador of an entire invisible world of Paleolithic emotion. Quirky tidbit. In one small pouch buried beside Neve, researchers found beads made from perforated shell fragments. The shells originated from the Ligurian coast, indicating they were collected or traded across many kilometers. It's a tiny window into a mobile, interconnected world, where even infants were woven into the broader web of life and movement. Her DNA, too, has more to say. It connects her to other ancient populations, helping scientists trace migrations, interbreeding, and genetic continuity across millennia. She was not an island, she was a thread, part of the great human tapestry that leads, eventually, to us. There's also a humbling note here. For all our satellites and databases, we still don't know exactly what Neve's people believed. Did they imagine an afterlife? Did they speak to spirits or honour ancestors? The symbols are there, but their meanings remain locked in silence. And maybe that's okay. Maybe it's enough to know that they cared. That in a dark, wind-blown cave, long before pyramids or poetry, someone looked at a tiny body and said, "She mattered." It's easy to think of the past as crude or cruel, but graves like Neve suggest something else, that long before we wrote books or built temples, we were already trying to make sense of loss, already reaching, fumbling, yearning, for memory, for meaning, for peace. Conclusion. Across 12,000 years, the grave of a single infant continues to whisper truths we're only beginning to understand. In a world defined by survival, The act of slowing down to bury a child with ornaments and care is an unmistakable signal. Love and mourning are ancient. They are not the inventions of cities or religions. They are the inheritance of humanity itself. Neve's tiny bones remind us that history is not only built by kings or warriors. Sometimes it's a child, wrapped in ochre, surrounded by seashells, who tells the most enduring story. A story of connection, of sorrow, of the quiet reverence our ancestors felt in the face of death. And that is why her grave still matters, because in her stillness, she reminds us of our shared past, fragile, emotional, sacred, the need to remember, to grieve, to leave behind more than footprints. If stories like these stir something ancient in you, consider subscribing for more.